Well, that seemed to go well enough. So now I'm just applying some grease, and here I'm using a graphite grease because I like the stickiness of it. It stays on the shaft very well, and in this case it doesn't matter that it doesn't shear smoothly because the forces involved here are quite large. You apply quite a large amount of force on the film advance lever. You have to for it to do its job. Likewise, the return spring is quite strong. So the stickiness of the grease is no problem. Not this grease anyway. That's not to say that grease can't be too sticky, because it certainly can. When it dries out, that's often a problem. Right, so that's done. I'm going to apply some synthetic grease to the spring, and I'll apply some synthetic grease to the cam plate at the end here, where those ratchet teeth are, both lower and upper. That's all that's required there. And that can go back in the body of the camera. And I'll have my take-up spool, which I've previously cleaned. The bush goes in the bottom of the spool. You can drop the spool into the camera, bush side down. And the film advance shaft drops in place. I'll just pop the lock lever back out of the way for the moment. Pull my release lever back out of the way so everything will drop into place. And that should leave me just lined up. So it's just sitting there in the rest position at the moment. The rewind's under no tension, but once it's screwed in place and everything's assembled to it, we will wind one full turn of tension on that shaft so that it returns nicely. If I was doing a reflex model, I'd want more tension on there because of the drag of the cocking mechanism on the reflexes. A full turn plus a third of a turn is about the appropriate amount of tension to go on for the rewind, the advance lever. Right, so that's sitting in place. And the next thing to do is to assemble the clutch and pop that in place. Now the clutch also is another area I use the graphite grease in. The clutch I also lubricate with graphite grease. I'll just smear some on the inside of the drum. Make sure I've got a good even coating. Then we have to get the spring and the centre in place. The spring has a little tab on the top of it, which has to drop into a little slot there. And then we have to compress the spring, and I'm using a pair of crimp pliers to do that. And I'm only squeezing lightly, I don't want to distort the spring at all. And I've pulled it into place, and as you saw, I rotated that with my finger and thumb, so that as I turned it, it pulled more of that spring into place. Now I can pop the shaft over the top, the drum over the top, and that's the clutch assembled. Now the clutch is much freer to move in one direction than the other. It has to have slip, and that's so that the film advance sprocket and the film advance shaft aren't locked to each other directly, otherwise, because otherwise you'd end up in trouble. As film builds up on the take-up spool, the diameter increases, and so with each revolution it would pull more film through the camera. The metering of the film is done by the sprocket shaft. So you would end up with a problem. You would end up basically, if your clutch is too tight, you'll end up tearing out sprocket holes. So the centre of the clutch I've just lubricated with a bit of synthetic grease. That can drop in over the shaft, and it just drops down into the body there. And you can see as I revolve the spool inside, you can see that gear is revolving too. This piece is held in with the guide bush, and the guide bush is here. That has a gear set on it, and I'm just lubricating that now with a bit of synthetic grease. I just apply some to that outside edge and squeeze it in with my thumb, and the hydraulic pressure will push that grease in underneath those surfaces. In the centre, I'll just give that a wipe with synthetic grease where it drops over the shaft, and then this just drops into the top of the camera. And revolve the film advance spool, take-up spool, to engage the gear and make sure that's sitting down there correctly. We have a single screw at the back. I'll just run that down lightly. And at the front we have our ratchet pawl. So there's a little spacer that goes on there first. The pawl and its retaining screw. The retaining screw has also got a groove around it where the spring fits, and we'll put that on in a minute. It looks good, just checking that that's moving smoothly. It is. So, the spring. Here is our spring. That needs to be popped down in place. That was it. It just pretty much fell into place, and you probably see that that spring loads that little pawl and keeps it engaged with this gear. And that's to stop the film from being able to move backwards through the camera at any stage, except when you're rewinding, of course. So I'm just wiping a little bit of synthetic grease around that inside edges and then through the centre where it contacts the top of that bush. If I rotate that anti-clockwise, you see that that ratchet just drops into place, that pawl. You can see the action of it. On top of that goes this spring. This, of course, was the piece I showed you with the fingerprints embossed in it. Excuse me. That doesn't want to be completely dry, it'll just rust. I always put a wipe of grease on that. And pop that drive dog on. And then we have this piece. Now this drive dog has got slightly beveled edges on two corners. They go underneath, they go downwards. Should be dead flat on the top. Pop that in place. Then we have a washer. Then we have the gear from the top of the film advance shaft. it sits down over that squared shaft. And finally we have the screw that holds it all in place. And I've got a screwdriver suitably dealt to put these things in. It's probably a bit big, but it does the job nicely. Here we go, that's done up tight. Now the cam plate at the bottom of the camera was prevented from rotating because of the lock lever which locks the film advance when it's at frame number 1. So that allowed me to tighten that screw up, so that piece is all in place. At the bottom of the camera we need to put the release lever, or the lock lever rather, for the rewind button, which is that piece, and it's the screw that retains it is this one, a shouldered screw, and the spring that operates it is this one. So I need to get these components into place. Now normally I lubricate the lever. I'm just looking at the state of this lever. I don't know whether you can see that. It's damaged. It's not flat. It's got a bend in it like this. That should be dead flat. Now basically that means it's been bent. To bend it, trying to think how you'd achieve that. It means that I'm not even sure how you'd do that. It would sit this way up. It would have to mean that the sprocket shaft had been forced downwards. I don't know how you could do that accidentally. It couldn't happen by itself. I'm going to replace that part, not because it's bent, because I could straighten it out, but because there's not much meat there in that metal across that hole. Inevitably it would be likely to crack and break, and I don't want that, so I'm going to find another one to replace it. Alright, well, I found another lever. The levers are common amongst a whole raft of retinas from the 3C era onwards. So I have a plentiful supply from the various carcasses around the place. This one I think came from a Retina Reflex-S that I was pillaging for parts just the other day. So that lever goes in place. I'll pop its return spring on. Now these are supposed to be symmetrical, and they probably were when they were new. Sometimes they're a bit distorted and need to be checked. That's a stepped screw. I have to make sure that it goes down properly and that lever is free to move. Now I can do that screw up tight. And I need to swing that spring over into place. And that's best done with a stronger pair of tweezers than I've currently got in my hand. So I will just get this other pair of tweezers and swing that spring into place. So now that lever is spring loaded. Next we need our sprocket shaft and sprocket. The sprocket's been cleaned, there's not much to the sprocket. It's got a slot that goes to the top of the camera, not much more to know about that. I'll lubricate the shaft with a bit of synthetic grease, and I'll put a little bit just on the gear itself. That goes in at the top of the camera. Down through the sprocket and up through the bottom of the camera there, if I can get that shaft lined up correctly. That's better. I turn that wheel, I should be able to get that to engage and drop in. I pull back my sprung loaded lever, that allows that to drop into place, and the gear is engaged now at the top. Now there's a screw that goes down in here which drives that sprocket shaft, and I need to find it. It's this little one here. It's the same as the screws that form the front door hinge pivots on the Retina IIIS type cameras. Alright, that's in place. At the base of the camera, I need to put the rewind button its washer and spring into place. I need to find the spring, which is here, and this I'll lubricate the spring with a bit of synthetic grease. The spring goes onto the rewind button, then our washer, and then it screws into the bottom of that shaft. The shaft has to go up through the washer, so check that the button can be pressed. That basically tells you that the spring is passing up through the shaft is passing up through the washer, and then we just need to tighten the button. Well, I've got a tool to do that. We've also got another way of doing it. This thing here, this pair of crimp lug pliers, nice rounded jaws on this one. It was some cheapie from years ago. That works very nicely for tightening up things like this. You do not need an awful lot of pressure on this. All I'm doing is holding the shaft firmly in place with my fingers, and I'll turn that lock button, and if it hurts your fingers holding that shaft, it's probably tight enough. Don't go mad, you will snap that screw off. So that's all in place. So if you move our film sprocket now, you'll see that it also revolves the take-up spool. If I hold the take-up spool from moving, the take-up spool is now in place, but the sprocket shaft still revolves, as does the gear on the top. Likewise, if I stop the sprocket shaft from turning, I can turn the take-up spool as I would do if I was. That's to allow slippage in the take-up. That's all good. It's exactly as it should be. When you press the rewind button and it latches into place. It lifts this gear out of engagement at the top so that the sprocket shaft is now free to rotate. That means that you can rewind your film, and the tension you feel when you're rewinding the film is due to the clutch in the take-up spool at the top there. So that's how that works. As soon as you swing the advance lever to advance the film, I managed to damage that spring. What happens is as you swing this, it releases the lever there and allows the gear here to re-engage so that take-up is back up again. Now, I've just damaged the spring on my release lever, so I'm going to remove that from the camera and straighten that up and put it back. That's frustrating because it was damaged when I took the camera apart, and I've pretty much put it right back where it was. So I'll take that spring off there. Reshape it and put it back. That's it. Just put that on the operating table. Alright, I'm happy with the shape of that. I'll put that back in place. Those tweezers weren't helping me, they were a bit magnetic. There it is, back in place on the shaft, and the shaft can go back into the camera. I'll get that spring swung into position correctly. That looks a lot happier. And then the screw can go on back in on the top. Now what had happened is I must have pressed this down too far, allowing that lever to rise to pass the cam on the film advance shaft, and then I've caught it on the bodywork, or I've caught it with my fingers while I've been working on it. That's better. That operates that lever as it should. Alright, so far so good. I'm just about ready to close up the base of the camera now, I think, for my purposes anyway. I've got some lubrication on these points, so I'm just going to add a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I've got a reduced base plate of the camera, which just covers at this end, leaves the front open so that I can get the front of the camera in place. But I want that all in place so I can get an advance lever on there while I'm working on the rest of the camera. So I need to crank one turn of tension onto this so that the film advance lever will return correctly. So I'll swing my lock lever across out of the way. Using 2 pairs of tweezers, I'll hold my release lever back. I'll wind a full turn of advance on there, drop my lock lever back into position. That'll hold it, so that's holding a full turn of tension on there at that stage. And I need my cover plate, which fits on the base of the camera. The cover plate is just a reduced base plate. You can see how it's been shortened down. And this is just to be put in place so that I can fit an advance lever while I'm working on the rest of the camera. If I'm working on a Retina IIIS, the same cover plate would be used, or a Retina Reflex type 025, again the same base plate would be used. And I will temporarily fit the advance lever again. I see I haven't cleaned that yet. And I'll put a couple of screws in that. I can see that there's quite a pronounced mark on the advance lever at that point. That's probably where the camera was dropped, and that would account for the end of the advance lever, the end of the advance shaft being loose. Right, so there's our film advance. This is the release lever, this button here, that releases it. This is the end of film lock. Now I'm holding that down as though it's not on frame number 1, and I can swing the advance. That moves smoothly, no resistance, very good. There are 2 screws here and here. I can tighten those up now. I'd left them slightly loose previously. That feels very good. It's more than adequate. The return tension on there is very good. At the top of the camera now I can put the chrome trim plate back on the top, and then we can put the shutter cocking rack, and that can go back in place. There's strap lugs at both ends, and the body at that stage has come along quite well. After that point it'll be installing the meter, and after installing the meter I think we're just about ready to put the shutter back on the front of the camera. But first of all, find the chrome trim plate for the top of the camera.